History of English Literature, Victorian Age, 1830 to 1890. Short questions with answers. Part B. Question 1. What do you mean by Victorianism? Answer. Victorianism is a term which is often used with reference to the reign of Queen Victoria. The term also extended beyond the Queen's reign 1837 to 1901 to include William IV's reign from 1830. Historians distinguished early, middle and late Victorian England. Under Queen Victoria, Britain, transformed by Industrial Revolution, became the world's leading imperial power and is the most interesting country. And the authors of the age try to focus the rapidly changing age, the term of Victorian literature. The authors of the age try to focus the characteristics of the Victorian age in their works. Tennyson in his work represents the spirit of faith and doubt. Arnold laments the loss of value. In fact, the moral history of the age is reflected by the authors of the age. In other words, social, political and religious ideas of the Victorian age are adequately expressed in the literature of the Victorian era. Victorianism is a term which refers to the tendencies of the Victorian era. In other words, Victorians are called Victorian. They are connected with the issues of their times and not with the issues of other ages. Question 2. Who are called the sages of Victorian age? Or what do you know about the moral history? Answer. The Victorian thinkers are called the sages of Victorian age. The influence of the Victorian thinkers are great on Victorian literature. Their works are an intellectual criticism of the age. Therefore, the Victorian thinkers such as Thomas Carlyle, John Stuart Mill, Newman, Charles Darwin and Arnold require some attention. Arnold believed poetry would replace religion. He considers poetry as a criticism of life. Like Arnold, the other thinkers of the Victorian age tried to focus the spiritual crisis and erosion of values of the Victorian age. At the end of 18th century, with the progress of science, people became skeptic. A conflict between science and religion appeared. New political and philosophical theories were published. Church lost its monopoly. Rapid changes took place with both internally and externally. Newman started the Oxford movement, which renewed the idea of traditional Christianity. These thinkers were the first to observe and understand the effects of industrial capitalism, scientific theories on social and personal life. Therefore, in their works and in art and literature, they try to show the significant currents of English national culture. Question 3. Write a note on Victorian compromise. Answer. The Victorian age doesn't mean precisely the years during which Queen Victoria reigned. Victorianism means an attitude to life and society. Too many influences work on the Victorian age. It was a change of internal and external changes. The literature of society shows the growing social consciousness, the political turmoil, the industrial revolution, the life of working class people, the political, intellectual and philosophical debate were reflected in the works of the authors. Therefore, we can say that there has been an attempt on the part of the authors to bring about a compromise between the various forces of the Victorian era. A compromise was necessary between the rich and the poor. Life was easy for those who had many power and wealth. On the other hand, millions suffer from poverty. Victorian society witnessed class consciousness, that is conflict between rich and poor. Tennyson's poetry adequately show the various tendencies and the compromises of the Victorian era. There was a compromise between democracy and kingship. It seems that people accepted the democracy. Victorian society witnessed the freedom of all men. There was compromise between war and peace, revolution and reconciliation. The most glaring conflict that Victorian age witnessed is the conflict between science and religion. The discovery of science, discovery of scientific theories brought a doubt in the minds of people. They were not sure whether to have faith in science or religion. The Victorian people suffered from faith and doubt. However, of all the Victorian authors, Tennyson is called the poet of Victorian compromise because in his poetry we find both the characteristics of the age. He tried to bring about a compromise between science and religion. His poems represent the big conflict between science and religion, the material advancement and the spiritual crisis of the age. His important poems are Locksley Hall, Ulysses, Tithonus, Oenion, In Memoriam, etc. These poems express the idea of compromise between the various issues of Victorian age. Question 4. Who is Darwin? Why is he important in the study of Victorian age? Or write a short note on Darwinism. Answer. Victorian age is an age of social unrest. It was a melting pot in the history of England. Too many influences worked on the Victorian era. The society was progressing from a backward 18th century society to the modern 20th century. With the advent of science and technology, the society progressed and achieved much scientific knowledge. There was development in the outlook of people. There was development in different branches of science. Darwin's theory of evolution brought about a radical change in the fundamental faith of mankind. Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species, 1859, opposed the biblical idea of human creation. Darwin defers the idea of the survival of the fittest. His another book, The Descent of Man, 1871, assembled new evidence that man was descended from apes. Geology has shown the earth to be millions of years old. In fact, the scientific research showed that Bible was not a scientific story. People were not sure whether science was true or New Testament was true. Therefore, the theory of evolution challenged Christian idea of the religion and end of mankind. Some, like Tennyson, modified their beliefs in the existence of God and destiny of human. Others, like Hardy, expressed their doubt. In fact, Darwin was not a social critic, but his work had much influence on the age, which is also clearly seen in the works of the novelists, especially in George Eliot. Question 5. Write a short note on naughty 90s of the Victorian literature. Answer. English literature of the last decade of the 19th century is termed as naughty 90s because it was a revolt against the tendencies of early decades of Queen Victoria. The Victorian era achieved much scientific knowledge and developed incomes of industry, trades and commerce. But at the end of the era, a new revolt arose. The publications of two magazines, Yellow Book and the Savoy, gave expression to the revolt against Victorian ideas. The revolt of the 90s has three aspects. Firstly, they emphasized the old idea of liberty, equality and fraternity. Secondly, they worship power rather than beauty. Thirdly, they challenged the values of art and life and criticized the idea of Victorian compromise. The 90s was a period of liberty activity. The 90s was a period of literary activity. Poetry, novel, and drama flourished with new vigor. Huxley, Oscar Wilde are some of the important writers of 90s. They reacted against Victorianism. They wanted to restore the spirit of romance to novel. They made a novel a criticism of social document. In poetry, we also find a similar reaction. Poetry became pessimistic in tone. It was a period of indecision and disillusionment. The drama of the 90s also marks a new beginning. In fact, the 90s was a revolt against Victorian ideas of manner and morality. Question 6. Write a note on the pre-Raphaelitism. Answer. At the late 19th century, the world has amazed at the newer invention of science and was busy with urbanization. At the time, a new trend of literature attracted the view of the world. A new literary trend set in. The authors are identified as pre-Raphaelites. Actually, it was a movement of art and painting that appeared before the time of great Italian poet Raphaelite. Raphaelite was an icon of art and culture during Italian Renaissance in the 14th century. Following the technique of Raphaelite to give simplicity and naturalness in art and literature is called Raphaelitism. Love for beauty and artistic sincerity were the cardinal aspect of their literary works. That is why their treatment of art, nature, and literature made them essentially romantic. Pictorial quality, love for beauty, affection for melancholy, etc., were dominating in their works. Sense of escapism was also noteworthy. The pre-Raphaelites wanted to take rest from busy social life. They were not carried away by the flood of the age. The debate of science, religion, faith, rationality, materialism, etc., the major concern of the age, couldn't touch them and distract them from their aim. They regarded poetry as an art. The slogan was art for art's sake. A sense of melancholia grasped them like their predecessors and was reflected in their poetry. However, the movement was led by a cluster of poets: D.G. Rossetti, C.G. Rossetti, William Morris, Swinburne were remarkable. D.G. Rossetti was the founder of pre-Raphaelitism. Simple love and beauty that the visual and appreciable to all were the theme of his poetry. He showed large ignorance for science, philosophy, history, and politics of the age. C.G. Rossetti was not out of the influence. She was devoted to Catholic Church, morality, history, death, and religion preoccupied her theme. Morris was famous for his storytelling technique. At the same time, he represented the aspect of return to nature. However, the pre-Raphaelites were successful as poets and they had true poetic quality. Sophistication and literalness were removed by the pre-Raphaelites and they could get a command over language, but universal vision of life was absent at their works. Question 7. Give a brief idea of the Oxford movement. Answer. The Oxford movement is a religious movement in the Victorian age that was led by John Henry Cardinal Newman. It is said that the movement had resemblance to pre-Raphaelite movement. The movement was a protest against materialism, powerful church, and the great aspiration for return to the spirit of Middle Ages. It was a break against Protestantism and returning to the bosom of a Roman Catholic Church. Newman found universality and the principle of authority only in Roman Catholicism. In fact, the movement was intended to bring a new life to Anglican Church by a revival of the doctrine and practice of an earlier period. The leader chose literature as their weapon. Tracts for the Times is remarkable as one of their weapons. To oppose liberalism and to restore the doctrine and authority of the early church was the center of their teaching. Their belief can be epitomized through the sentence, "I believe in one Catholic and Apostolic Church." The movement began at Oxford with Cabell's famous sermon on national apostasy in 1833. But Newman was the real leader of the movement, which practically ended when he entered the Catholic Church in 1845. Question 8. Who was Ralph Waldo Emerson? Write a short note on him. Answer. Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882, was among the most important of the men of letters that America produced during his epoch. He was a notable disciple of Carlyle. He was born at Boston of a distinguished clerical family and educated at Harvard College. The death of his father had left the family in strained circumstances, and Emerson took to school teaching. From this, he turned to the church and became a Unitarian minister. Religious doubts, however, drove him from the ministry, and feeble health sent him on a long sea voyage, 1832. Returning to America, he became a traveling lecturer, expounding his views on religion and philosophy. These opinions were further developed in several volumes of essays, whose clearness and attractiveness brought him much applause. Henceforth, his life was uneventfully prosperous. In 1847, he visited Europe, spending a week with Carlyle and delivering lectures in England and Scotland. He died in his quiet home at Concord. Emerson's work comprised 11 volumes of lectures and essays which cover a wide choice of subjects but deal chiefly with the conduct of life. In religion, like Carlyle, he was not no particular sect, but again, like Carlyle, he had high ideals, enthusiasm, and an honest desire for youth and justice. His style is remarkably uniform. It is sweet and limpid and enlightened with apt illustrations. He is fond of using a series of short sentences in the manner of Macaulay. It is the ideal expository style, with the addition of sufficient literary grace to give it permanent value. Question 9. Why is Tennyson called a poet of Victorian compromise? Answer. Victorian age does not precisely mean the reign of Queen Victoria. It means an attitude to life and things. Victorian age was an age of changes. It was an age of rapid industrialization and scientific development. Too many factors worked on the Victorian era. Because of the advancement of scientific and materialism, religion or Christianity forced a setback. People suffered from faith and doubt, they were not sure whether to have faith in a religion or science. Victorian age has to compromise between faith and doubt, science and religion. Victorian era has produced a number of critics and writers: Tennyson, Newman, Carlyle, Ruskin, Arnold, etc. In their works, try to reflect the spirit of Victorian society. Of all the authors of the age, Tennyson was the most representative part of the age. He alone represents the age. In his poem, we find a compromise between the rich and the poor, compromise between royalists and democracy, compromise between science and religion. Reading his poems seems like reading newspaper of the Victorian era. It gives us the current history of Victorian era. Tennyson has watched the conflict between science and religion. He was aware of the problems of that age. Science, he could not solve the problems. I repeat it. Since he could not solve the problem, he did not run away. Rather, he tried to focus the tendencies of the age. Therefore, he is called the poet of the Victorian compromise. Question 10. What do you know about Henry Newman and his contribution to Victorian literature? Answer. Henry Newman was best known as John Henry Cardinal Newman. He is important as a religious personality in the religious history of England. He was widely read in the Bible. He was a man of letters. His theological writing earned him popularity. His most inspiring book, The Idea of University, provides to the modern university the basic principles concerning the university, its location, its aim, the qualification of teachers, etc. According to him, the idea of university is not to prepare students for professional courses, but to impart liberal education that will make students gentlemen and gentle ladies in their real life. However, Newman wrote many essays concerning the controversial issues of his time. He was also the leader of the Oxford movement. The Oxford movement was a religious movement. It was not a political movement. It opposed liberalism in all aspects of life. The leaders of Oxford movement were influenced by the idea of conservatism. The Oxford movement opposed the national matters concerning with the church. It was also known as a Tractarian movement. It tried to revive fundamental faith in religion. The Oxford movement was allied to its Romantic movement. It inspired the restoration of Romanticism, mysticism, spiritual beauty, etc. It is stood against the secularism. Newman was the soul and spirit of the Oxford movement. Thank you, viewers, for watching.